Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalan Johnson. My guest today is Alana Carvalho. Alana is a licensed mental health counselor, author, speaker, and podcast host who has dedicated her career to helping individuals, couples, and families heal the unconscious patterns that keep them stuck in codependency, perfectionism, people pleasing, and self abandonment. Her clinical work is rooted in the belief that the way we show up in relationships is deeply connected to the way we were taught to see ourselves, and her mission is to help people unlearn the roles they were handed and reclaim who they really are. Alana is the author of the book Raising Empowered Children and the host of the podcast The Codependent Perfectionist, where she explores the emotional patterns behind people pleasing, self sacrifice, and unmet childhood needs. Alana's work is especially known for its clarity and compassion and her way of making complex emotional dynamics feel human and accessible. Whether she's speaking to a mother trying to break generational cycles, a partner who's constantly putting themselves last, or an adult still carrying wounds from childhood, Alana's message is clear. Healing doesn't require perfection. It requires presence, boundaries, and the willingness to choose yourself again and again. So, Alana, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful introduction.
Thank you. Also, I did give a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Sure. Um, so, as was mentioned, my name is Alana Carvalho. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I have a private practice in New York City. Um, from as early as I can remember, I knew I was going to be a therapist. It's just been in my bones my whole life. I always knew that I wanted to help people. I always knew that I was interested in like how people were feeling and what they were thinking. It's just always been something that's like deeply ingrained in me. Um, so from an early age, I was one of those like sensitive, introspective kind of kids. And I think that just lended to, the fact that this work is perfect for me. Um, and, I've had a lot of struggles with codependency and perfectionism over the years and had an amazing therapist early in my life that um, was able to help me understand what that meant and how that was impacting me in my relationships. And I just knew after that, I was like, that's the work I want to do. I just want to help people with these same kind of, relationship patterns because um, it just I see how it kind of impacts so many people. It's such a vast, topic in so many ways. And so that kind of got me starting my work. And I did some work in substance abuse for quite some time and also just saw how codependency was just so rampant in that area as well. And so between the two of those things, I was like, yep, this is it. And that, continued my journey.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's true that I've seen a lot that a lot of therapists are called to the work that they do because of their early life or their experiences. And being that you have, I guess maybe your struggles were with some of the things that you specialize in now, it kind of makes you like perfect for the job because you're not going into it and helping people with something that you're not familiar with.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing like doing the work that you help other people with, you know.
Mm.
Um, there's like a saying, what the teacher teaches is also their greatest lesson. Um, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that, usually the work that we're doing is in some way really meaningful for ourselves. Um, and I also like the fact that, when I'm talking about these things, I'm not talking about it just from an intellectual standpoint, but I truly understand, the struggles and how hard it is to work on ourselves, especially these types of issues.
Yeah, that's important. It really is. When you think about these patterns like codependency and perfectionism, what is it that you see most in working with people? And what do you wish that people understood about what these patterns are really about and where they stem from?
Oh goodness. I mentioned before it's really vast. It's hard to say that there's like one thing that I see, all the time, but I will say that I do think we from an early age are kind of primed to um like not consider what's really important to us, not think about our own needs and how to get those met. Um we're often taught, I think, by the adults around us that we need to kind of like acquiesce to the people
Mm,
around us, make other people feel good. Um, and so it becomes really hard, I think, as we become adults to know, well, what does that mean for me as an adult? Like, is my role still to make people happy, or, is there something else that's actually more important to me? And, it's tough because when I talk about codependency, it's such a gray area when we work on healing. The idea isn't that we all become these selfish, hyper individualistic people. That's not the idea either. The idea is that we learn how to interdependently connect with other people without losing ourselves or at the expense of really important aspects of who we are, right? So it's trying to find this balance of how do we both, you know, connect with others, show care towards others without losing ourselves within that. And I think that's really challenging for people because we tend to live in extremes where it's either like we're kind of like losing ourselves or it's like all about me. Um, and neither of those is really what we're aiming for when we're healing codependency.
yeah. Thank you for saying that because it's true, especially if you grew up with adults that didn't have a good emotional map when and they were most concerned with images and how things look. So as a child, you may have just been something that was flaunted to the world to look a certain way, to make your parents look a certain way, or make the adults or in your community or caregivers look a certain way. And then once you realize in adulthood, like, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. Like you could go all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum. So it's important to find that sweet spot, like you mentioned, so that it's not just one extreme to the other.
Right. And it's so common when we are working on ourselves, like it does make sense that we might vacillate to the other extreme before we find that middle ground. And
Mhm.
that's okay as long as we understand that the idea isn't to get stuck in the other extreme and that we're meant to just become selfish individuals. Like that's not it either. So as long as we're like working on identifying that, being aware of it, we will eventually find the middle ground.
Sure. And I think it's important that you stated that because I think most of us, when we do like have the realization of, oh, I don't have to be that person anymore, we kind of do go to that opposite end of the spectrum. But we don't want to stay there. We just, dip our toes there and realize, okay, there's something else, and then kind of work our way back to the middle. Because if you
Exactly.
do get stuck there, then it's just one extreme to the next, like you said.
Exactly. And that's not really what our true self is about either. So, all the recovery is about finding our true self.
Mm,
Usually, our true self does not exist at either of those extremes where it's selfless or selfish. It's usually somewhere really in the middle.
sure. And you said that you were called to this work because of your early life. So I wanted to ask you, what were your early experiences like that you were familiar with these patterns, and what did life look like for you growing up?
So, I grew up in a pretty average home of sorts, and I'm the younger child, and I was always the really sensitive, like
Mm,
quiet one. And I was always kind of just very like sensitive to what was happening around me. Always picking up on like the emotions of other people or the thoughts and because of my being sensitive and also being kind of like an empathic kind of child, I really tried to move around people and make sure people were okay all the time. Like that was how I thought you just needed to navigate life, was like making sure everybody was okay, and like making sure people weren't upset and all of those kind of things. Um, and as kids, we tend to really think so many things are about us that are, of course, not, but we internalize them in that way. And I certainly was like that, and thought, like, it's me who needs to make sure everybody's okay, and is just going along with what works for everybody else, kind of thing. um, and at some point in my life, there I could tell that there was a lot of anger that I was kind of harboring with that I wasn't kind of understanding why and where that was coming from. And that's where therapy became so helpful, because I understood that what was happening, unfortunately, was because I was like stuffing all of my needs and just worried about what everybody else was feeling and doing, that I started to become really resentful.
Mhm.
And I didn't know kind of what to do with that. And so she was able to really help me identify where my behavior was really problematic in a way that was creating that like resentment and anger, and that I needed a lot of work on changing those patterns at that point. Um, and it was really hard. It's hard work. I mean, I still work on codependency to this day, and that was over 20 years ago. But like that's when we kind of, I think, need to realize that something is not okay, is when we recognize that there's resentment or anger or deep sadness or something that's kind of lingering under the surface of all of this stuff. That's a signal something's not okay. I'm doing something at the expense of myself here.
Did you learn these things just based on, I guess, your environment, or were there any like unspoken messages that you received about what you needed to do in order to be loved, or how you had to be good, or things of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always felt like I needed to behave in a certain way, or, be like the sweet child, the sweet, good child, to
Mhm.
like feel that love. And yeah, I was like the good kid in the family for some time. And that's how, like, I kind of, I put myself in a box in that way. And I think I was seen that way. And, so it all kind of came together, and then it really like limited my ability to discover who I really was, because I felt like I needed to kind of stay in this identity of like the good kid. um and it was hard because transitioning out of that, people are really like, whoa, who's this person? Like, she
Right.
was like the quiet good kid, and now she's like, a little outspoken, and maybe, not so nice all the time. So that was a really hard transition that I could tell was really tough for like my family and, you know, some of my friends. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it for me and for many people are unspoken messages, or sometimes they're explicit. I mean, it happens both ways. Because of your personality, you kind of naturally fit into a certain role in the family, and then it's expected for you to stay in that, like, being the peacekeeper, or being the one who is the helper and all of that. Like, that was me. I was like, I love to help. I love to be the good one. I love to, be there all the time, all of those things. And so it just all started to form this identity that at some point I was like, wait a second, I feel really constrained by this. And I'm not sure that it fits actually who I am.
I think that moment of realization, or awakening, can be really scary, because once you realize that maybe your voice has been suppressed, and that stepping into your power is going to make other people uncomfortable, there's a lot that can be lost in you, not playing your role anymore, not being the good girl, or now she's outspoken, or like, who does she think she is? Like, she's different, or people look at you and they start to judge you based on your transformation.
Mhm.
um what was it like for you experiencing that? Like, how did your nervous system respond to now being someone who was no longer, I guess, just willing to take a role where you were on the back burner or be in the back seat kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think my nervous system went totally haywire for a
Mm,
period of time, you know, and I think that's that's what everyone should kind of have in their mind because what we basically have done is figured out how to calm our nervous system by doing things like people pleasing and caretaking and all of this stuff that helps us feel safe, right? When we play the role, when we do everything like we're supposed to, like we feel safe, right? So when we step out of that, to it's so jarring to our whole body, right? It's like everything feels like danger, right? Like
mm,
speaking sometimes could feel like danger. I mean, I remember times where I was like stuttering when I was speaking because I was so nervous to say like things that weren't really controversial. It was just me speaking in a way that I never spoke before, right? So, there I think what we need to understand is that it's such a like long undoing process when we start recovering. That's why, I understand most people don't want to do that because it's painful, and I did go through years of moving through that and feeling like I'm getting chased by bears, but doing basic things and all of that kind of stuff. Um, and, of course, now it's like, thank God I did, because being on the other side, my body's in such a different place. My ability to speak to things, um, just confidence, all of the stuff. I mean, it's so different, of course, now, but there's, years of discomfort that I had to go through and that most people will have to go through if they want to work through changing some of these patterns.
yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
All right, so let's get into some of the patterns, starting with perfectionism, because perfectionism is often praised as ambition or high standards, but underneath it can feel like a desperate attempt to avoid shame, rejection, or feeling not enough. So I wanted to ask, what are perfectionists really afraid of, and where does that fear begin?
Right. My feeling is that perfectionists are so afraid of not feeling loved really at the end of the day is what it kind of comes down to. There's a lot where we get a sense of love from our ability to achieve and to do, right? Whether it's the love that we feel towards ourselves or the love that we receive from other people, right? Like in our perfectionism, we can be so unkind and so unloving towards ourselves if we don't do enough or, we're not the best or whatever the thing might be that we're holding ourselves to, which is really challenging because it's very painful to be in that place where we like are withholding of love to ourselves and don't feel like we will be loved if we don't meet certain standards.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a slippery slope because to feel like you have to abandon who you are to receive love, and then the love that you're getting isn't enough because you're not really expressing what your needs are, so they're not being met, but you're just stuck in this loop and stuck in this cycle.
Mhm.
So identifying the cycle and identifying how to break free from it can be so helpful. And that's why individuals such as yourself who break down these patterns about perfectionism and people pleasing and things of that nature, I feel like are invaluable. Um, Another question about perfectionism that I wanted to ask is when perfectionism is driving someone's choices, how does it affect their identity, their relationships, and their ability to rest?
Oof. Well, there was a time in my life that I didn't know that you could take off from work to rest. I didn't know that, it's so funny looking back, but as a perfectionist, like it never occurred to me that we could just like stop and take care of ourselves, because mine was all about like go, 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 do, 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 achieve, achieve, achieve. Um, and so I think we really struggle with self-care as perfectionists because it's like in our perfectionism, all we're thinking about is how much we've gotten done in a sense. Like, was that effective use of time? Like everything is about like maximizing, the moments and all of this. And so we forget that like sleep is important, rest is important, doing things like sometimes we just need to turn the TV on and veg out. Like, whatever the thing is, like all of that is worthy too. It doesn't have to be that there's only, um, you know, uh, like worth in doing tasks or accomplishing whatever it might be in a day in regards to your work or whatever, right? Unfortunately, like as perfectionists, that's how we tend to view things and experience the world. So we have a very tough time just taking care of ourselves. um Identity wise, I think we get very wrapped up in seeing our accomplishments as our identity, right? And that's an issue in codependency too, because we see them as like the roles we play in our life. That's where when we're doing like the recovery work, it's really confronting because we realize that our identity is really wrapped up in all of these external facets of our life and not really about what's in here, right? What's inside. So for me, I had to do a lot of work on understanding who I really am versus what I have to offer to other people or what role I play for them. Or like what my job title is or how much I've worked in a week or how much I made that week, right? Like all of those things were my identity at some point. And, when we are able to work through that stuff, it's not that, I think a lot of people go, oh my God, but I don't want to be somebody who's not like motivated and successful and all this stuff. You can be all of those things without perfectionism. The difference is that you'll probably have a lot more joy in your life. It's not that you won't want to achieve or anything like that. You just will feel much better about it because it won't be, um, as high stakes for you, right? Because when we tie things to our identity, it becomes very high stakes. Like I need this because it's about who I am versus like this would be a wonderful addition to my life, right? Which is a much lighter way to move through, our everyday.
When you say it like that, like, so if your identity is your job or how much money you make or the car that you drive or the house that you live in, and then you lose that, like, where are you? What do you do? And so that's why I think realizing that our worth isn't tied to possessions or, hustle culture or things of that nature. Because when those things go away, we are literally left at rock bottom without knowing what to do, how to do it, or who we are.
Right. Right.
Mm,
That's the problem, right?
yeah. So let's jump into codependency because I think that is something we all struggle with. And a lot of us need help with it. And if you could you define what codependency is?
So codependency is so many things, but what I like to
Mm,
tell people is at its basis, it's caring too much and a lack of self trust. And when you combine those two things together, it becomes very challenging for us relationally.
mm, okay. Um, it's also more than just being too helpful, I believe, and it can
Mm,
also be rooted in enmeshment or loss of self. How can
right.
someone recognize when their identity is wrapped up in being needed and rescuing others?
Well, I think it's looking, part of working on recovery is becoming aware, right?
Mhm,
And we need to understand like what we're doing in our relationships, right? So if somebody is going through something and we feel internally like, I must be there for them, I must talk to them every day. I must go do these errands for them. Like these things that feel like compulsory in a sense. That's usually when we're more on the codependent side. When we decide, you know, my friend's going through a really hard time. I think I'm going to pick up some groceries for them. That's totally fine. Like, that's not inherently codependent. That's actually lovely. That's a very nice thing to do for someone else. But if I feel like I have to do that, like if I don't do that, I'm not a good friend, right? Then we're into the codependency territory because we think that we need to do that in order to be the good friend instead of just doing it out of the goodness of our heart because we want to, right? So to me, a lot of codependency has to do with us looking at when we feel compelled to do something, we feel like we can't not do the thing, right? I was just talking with a client about this yesterday, and she said she was talking about doing something for her roommate. And I said, you could do the same behavior codependently and you could do it non-codependently. Codependently means you feel like you can't speak up to her and say that you didn't want to do it, that you felt like if you didn't do it, she would be mad at you and that would be a problem. Like you wanted to avoid the difficulty of like a hard conversation. All of that is codependent. But you could do something nice for her and not be codependent at all, right? You could do the exact same thing if you know that you could say no to it, right? If you don't believe that that defines the relationship and means so much, right? If you can have the difficult conversation, all of that makes it non-codependent. The same behavior,
Mhm.
right? So a lot of this has to do with what it feels like internally for us and the meaning that we make of it versus the behavior itself, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. I mean, because if we give something meaning, then we're guided by that. And if it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, then we can change how we respond to it.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Then we
What
have
would you
choice,
oh,
right?
yeah,
Like
then we have choice. Mhm.
independents feel like they don't have choice. They
Mhm.
feel like they have to do a lot of things,
Mhm.
right?
How is childhood connected to codependency?
So a lot of codependents were codependents as kids. And there's kind of a natural time, I think, in life, like developmentally appropriate, where we have, the start of codependency. But when we go through things like if we have a parent who has a mental health issue or substance abuse issue, or sometimes it can happen where you have a sibling who is very ill, or you've experienced significant trauma, or your parents are in a very difficult marriage, right? Like there's all of these different factors mixed with our personality and our birth order and all of the things that kind of come together and can lend towards us becoming codependent in our adulthood, right? Like if we become the kid who is the good kid because we have the sick sibling, right? Or we are the person that our parent relies on because they don't have a good emotional support from their partner, right? Like all of those things create codependency. And they can come from all different, types of situations, but that really lends towards it because, again, we get stuck in that role and then it's hard for us to move out of it into our adulthood because it starts to become our identity.
What do you think is at the core of people pleasing and codependency? Um, because I think if it can start in childhood, we may be working for something or trying to attain something. So what do you think that could be?
So I think it has to do with both, again, the desire to be loved and learning how to receive love from other people, right? And also a lot of times it has to do with our self-esteem,
Mm.
right? Like when we struggle with self-esteem and we get it from helping other people because we get praised or we get, it's like, oh, Alana, she's so helpful, right? that can boost our self-esteem. Like it feels good for somebody to say that about us, right? And so unfortunately, like if our self-esteem is all wrapped up in this role, it can be very fragile, right? And then it makes it hard for us to say to not be the helpful one, right? Because we're fearful that people both won't love us, accept us, and that we're not going to feel good about ourselves because we're already struggling with that.
Another aspect of this that can affect our lives is people pleasing. And we kind of have touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more because people pleasing can look like kindness on the outside, but it can often come at the cost of self betrayal. So, what are some subtle ways it shows up in daily life, and how can we start to spot and interrupt the pattern?
So for me, people pleasing showed up a lot in like readily saying yes to things, like without even thinking about it, right? Like the person's like, "Hey, could you do this?" Yeah, right? Like, and it's like, "Whoa, okay, hold on, hold on one sec. I didn't even think about it, and I'm already saying yes, right? Because I just don't. I just want the other person to be like, "Oh, like that's great. Alana's, willing to do that, right?" We have to be mindful that we have to like slow ourselves down. There's nothing wrong with saying to somebody else, let me think about that and get back to you. Right. But usually, because our people pleasing desire, to be accepted and all of those things is so strong, we're moving so quickly in the world and we don't feel like we have choice. Again, it's like, I must do this because there's a voice within us that says, if you don't, they're not going to like you. If you don't, they're not going to be your friend, whatever the thing is, right? So we have to like slow ourselves down and start to really reflect like, does that work for me? Or if I do that, does that affect me negatively in some way? Or can I do it, but maybe I need boundaries around it, right? Like there's all sorts of questions if we start to come a little bit more inward rather than it being so like external in terms of like saying yes, doing whatever the other person wants, making them feel good, making everything okay, right? Um, that can create actually much more depth in a relationship, which is a funny thing because I think, as a people pleaser, we can be very likable, right? But we often don't have a lot of depth in our relationship because there's no room for like true intimacy, right? Intimacy is developed when we are obviously honest in ourselves, but also when we go through difficult things with other people. Like we have challenging conversations. We, talk about something that like is uncomfortable. All of that stuff creates more intimacy in a relationship, which creates deeper connection. So when we're avoidant of that, we actually tend to create very surface level relationships with people that are very fragile. And unfortunately, over time, that can be very hard for us because then we recognize, oh my God, like all of my relationships are like a house of cards that if I just make one wrong step now, it feels like it's going to all come tumbling down because we've created such a poor foundation for them.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's so true. If you don't have hard conversations or if you're avoiding conflict, you never get to a point where you can establish anything within the relationship that would give it any strength if there's a storm. And
Right.
so having it's almost like instead of choosing to have like 4 or 5 solid relationships, when we struggle with conflict or being our true selves, we'll have a bunch of surface level relationships
Mhm.
that give us the illusion of having something that is solid. But like you
Right.
said, they can all be, essentially just a house of cards.
Mhm. And the difficult part for us is that internally we're usually pretty lonely in that space.
Mhm.
Like we don't because inside like our true self knows everything in a sense, right? And so it kind of knows like, wow, like I don't really feel deeply connected to anybody, right? Like that's not good for us as humans. Like, we need those deeper connections. It helps us move through the world and feel safe and feel loved and feel connected. When we don't have that, there's so much that we can struggle with.
Yeah, that's so true. I want to talk about the nervous system a little bit,
Yeah.
because a lot of these patterns, especially people pleasing and codependency, they're not just habits. They can turn into nervous system responses over time.
Right.
What does it mean when the body makes decisions before we're consciously aware? And how can we understand the body's role if these patterns help someone see their behavior in a more compassionate way and with a more empowered lens?
So I will say just off the bat, as we kind of touched on earlier, one of the main problems with codependency is that our barometer of fear is way off, right?
Mm,
We start to, because we've created these coping mechanisms to help us move through difficult situations that relieve us of difficult feelings, right? And so when we use codependency in that way, the problem is that over time, our body believes that anything that's not within the realms of codependency is a danger of some sort to us, right? So we start to get very activated by things like difficult conversations, the potential that someone will disagree with us, that someone is mad or someone is upset, or these things that are really important aspects of everyday life that should be totally fine become things that feel like I'm going to get eaten alive, right? Like, we start to get panicked. We start to get like very uncomfortable, right? So that is our nervous system alerting us that something is not right. The problem is that what is it's really alerting us is that we are overly impacted by situations that we need to learn how to regulate ourselves differently around. And that's really important because as we move through life, our body is a really important, helpful tool to help us know when something is or is not right for us. But when we are in like significant codependency, it doesn't know the difference between things that are actually okay and things that are truly not okay. So everything kind of becomes not okay in a sense, right? Which is where we're like overly activated. And so we're using these tools that we've figured out in our earlier life to help us deactivate ourselves, right? So our nervous system is not so flared. Um, that's where we kind of have to decide whether we're open to re-regulating that system so that it doesn't think that everything that's difficult or that's uncomfortable is actually bad for us. It's not bad for us. It just is. I mean, it's a part of life, right? It's only bad when we believe it to be that way, right? So we have to be willing to go through that difficult period of re-regulating, and that may take, again, years, and it still may happen after you've done really significant work, but where you are much calmer and able to move through life in a way that's not so activated.
mm. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
And we talked a little bit about what healing can look like and feel like, and how others can respond to it. And sometimes when people start healing these patterns, they're met with resistance, even judgment from those around them.
Sure.
Um, so when someone is no longer available to overfunction, their growth can look like selfishness to people who grew accustomed to or benefited from who they were. So I wanted to ask you, what's your advice for staying true to and protecting your peace when someone's evolution can make others uncomfortable?
Well, I will say this: your evolution should make other people feel uncomfortable.
Mm,
My mentor used to say to me, change is uncomfortable for everybody, even when it's good change, right? Like, we are creatures of habit. We don't like things to be different. So if when someone in your life starts to change, even if it's a positive thing, it still feels uncomfortable for us. Like we don't like it, you know? And so it's very common that you would experience pushback or like, negative reactions from the people around you because they don't want their dynamics to change, right? That doesn't mean that everybody around you is unsupportive or uncaring. You kind of have to be understanding and give people time to like shift with you. You can't assume that just because you've started changing that everyone's just going to say, "Oh, great, that's wonderful." Right? Like it's kind of like, "No, this is awkward and uncomfortable and now I'm not sure where I stand with you." And so all of that is totally appropriate. It's different, like, many of us codependents often have at least one, maybe multiple people in our life that really don't want us to grow. Like, truly, they're, like, rooting for the other side kinda thing, you know? And that is very different. You if you're working on yourself and you start to change, and you see someone who repeatedly after time and time again is still trying to kind of bring you down, not accept who you are as you're changing, not trying to understand what you're going through, that to me is different than the normal reaction of discomfort and, not kind of knowing how to shift with the dynamic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It does.
Mhm.
It does. Thank you for that. Because I know a lot of people need that help when it comes to feeling alone when they're healing because it's uncomfortable, it's scary, and the people around us are now looking at us as, selfish because we're putting our needs first or because we're saying no now, and no can feel like a threat. So I just wanted to ask that question to allow others to have support as they're on their journeys in healing. So thank you
And
for
I
that.
will say, like, one of the main things that I teach people when we're working on this stuff is how important communication is.
Mm,
Because if you start to change and nobody knows that you're working on yourself and nobody knows what's happening, that's very jarring to somebody else. That they don't know why you're saying no suddenly and you've never said no before, right? So people
mm,
start to create stories about that if they don't have the information to fill in, right? So if it's very different if you come to somebody and that you care about and you trust and you say, "Hey, I just want you to know, like, I've started working on myself. I'm going to start trying to say no more often because I've noticed that it's a problem for me that I never consider whether I actually want to do something and it works for me. So you might notice me saying no more often, right? Like you're giving the other person a heads up. Like, this is what I'm doing right now. This is how I'm working on myself. So at least the other person has context to it, right? If you just suddenly just change who you are, you have to understand that people are going to be like, "Whoa, like what's going on here?" Um and of course you don't have to share the same information with everybody, but some information is usually important and helpful.
yeah. Thanks for that. All right, I got a bit of a personal question for you.
Sure.
With all the work that you're doing to help others, what is it that you want people to know most?
Oh my, that's a good question that I don't know off the top of my head. What do I want people to know most? Um I think that they're not alone. I think when we're working on ourselves, we can feel really alone and like it's just us who's going through this. And that's kind of why, I call myself the codependent perfectionist because I'm like, you're not alone. I'm working on it too. Because it can be such like, an internal process and we don't know the depths of what other people are experiencing so often. And that's kind of what I love about being a therapist is I get to hear about all of that. Like I do know what people are struggling with that they're not sharing with others in their life. Um, but I think as a society, we don't tend to talk about a lot of those things, and so we all kind of feel pretty isolated when we begin, when we're working on ourselves and when we're feeling all sorts of different ways, we kind of think it's just us. And it's certainly not just us. It's actually most people, we just don't realize it because we're not talking about it.
Right. It's tough to talk about things that internally feel too big. Um, so thank you for sharing that, because I do think that when people can realize that it's not just them and that there's other people having the same struggles, it can create more open dialogue and community.
Absolutely.
All right. If you could be known for one thing that would define your legacy, what would you
Oh
want that to be?
goodness. My deep care for my clients, and they know that. They know that about me, but I really, really love and care for the people that I work with, and I think that's what makes a difference as a therapist, when you can really feel into how um how much you care for the people that you're working with. It's like a really wonderful thing.
Yeah, I'm sure your clients can feel it too. So thank you for the work that you do and the way you help them. All right, last question for you.
Mm.
If you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental health or emotional health or codependency, people pleasing, or any of the things that we talked about today that might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say to them?
Hmm. Honestly, start anywhere. Read a book, follow my Instagram, join a support group. There's so many places. Like, just start the process and just see where it takes you. Like, get the support. So many people think that therapy is reserved for people who are like just down and out, like you're just at the bottom. That is not what therapy is meant to be there for. And in fact, it makes therapy much harder if you wait until you're down and out to go to therapy, right? Like, you really like can use therapy as such an important tool to grow and get to know yourself and get support. Like, there's so many important pieces of it that work better when you're not in like desperation, right? Um, so get the support, find the right communities, like the right people are out there. There's so many people that are working on themselves and like in this um that, you know, it's like don't shy away from it. It's the best thing you could do for yourself. I will just tell you that much.
Thanks for that. Thank you for this. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your nuggets and your wisdom. And thank you for doing the work to get to a place where you can help others with these things, because it's so important.
Absolutely. I love it. And thank you for having me to chat about it.
Sure. If people want to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
Sure. So you can find me on my Instagram, which is the Codependent Perfectionist, my website, which is alanacarvalho.com. And I've got lots of resources. I even have a quiz if you want to find out more, if identify as codependent or perfectionistic. Um, and so, yeah, and you're welcome to reach out to me in either of those places.
And then your book.
And my book, Raising Empowered Children, The Codependent Perfectionist Guide to Parenting, is on Amazon. And I also have Oracle cards, which are like daily guidance to help you with your codependency and perfectionism work.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Or again, thank you for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
Oh, thank you.